Welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. I'm your host, Various Artists, and please join me as I time travel back and revisit almost every live show I've ever seen from 1975 to the present. Hey everybody, I'm your host, Various Artists, and welcome to MyLifeInConcert.com. In this podcast series, I'm going to recount almost every gig I've ever seen with a mix of memories and retrospective observations. And that's particularly relevant to today's episode, the third in the podcast series and concert number 7 in the actual blog series. Because to start off the series, I'm looking at one show from each of the 5 decades I've been a concert goer. And this is my show for the 80s, and it is the Ramones with the Demics at Centennial Hall, London, Ontario, Tuesday, May 20th, 1980. And the title of today's episode is Here Today, Gone Tomorrow. Back to what I was saying. The thing about looking back on these shows from a lot of distance is at the time, you're having the experience, and it's all very fresh to you, and, you know, you're sort of going through your life, and there's things you may not be aware of or where things are heading or whatever, and then when you look back, you can see things in a context, and there might be more substance and resonance in that memory looking back with that context that you would not have been aware of at the time. And again, this concert is a perfect example. At the time, I was just so excited that the Ramones were coming to London and that I was finally going to be getting to see them. And also that the Demics were opening up. And the Demics essentially did for London what the Ramones had done in New York, and that's kickstart the local punk scene. Now, this concert took place in a time where I think both camps had a lot of optimism, because the Ramones had just recorded their 5th album, End of the Century, with Phil Spector producing, and it got a whole level of press and attention that they hadn't gotten with the previous albums, at least in North America. Meanwhile, London's own Demics, who had long ago decamped to Toronto, they'd released their fantastic debut, 5-track debut AP, Talks Cheap, in early 1979, and in 1980, the new Toronto version of the Demics were releasing their self-titled new album. It was going to be an accessible version of the band, and they were going to explode, and the whole momentum that had been going starting in London for the past few years would explode nationally. And with the Ramones, the whole momentum that had started with their debut album back in 1976 was finally going to blow open and blow up in North America, that had happened more so over in Britain and Europe. So the energy was high, the spirits were high, the hope going forward was high, but what really happened? That's something I'm going to be examining in this podcast. And joining me later in the episode will be special guests. Now, just to let you know, this podcast is based on a blog that I wrote from 2010 to 2015 on opensalon.com, and then the blog closed with it. And I've had my version going at MyLifeInConcert.com through the years, but it's been fairly dormant. When I was actively writing it, because I was writing about and will be speaking about people who maybe I'm not in touch with, or, you know, whatever, I just want to give privacy. Of course, everyone has their own take on events as well. So I have come up with pseudonyms of meaning for various people who are in the blog, and some of them will be appearing in the podcast. And Special Guests is one of them. Now, he was living in London at the time and moved to the UK a few years later, where he has since resided. And I interviewed him in Leeds for the podcast, and I'll be interpolating his memories in with mine. Perhaps I'll start by talking about how I heard about the Ramones, what they meant to me, etc., etc. And I actually watched them from the start of their career, from the perch of my bedroom in suburban London, Ontario, via Rock Scene magazine. Now, I've mentioned Rock Scene magazine before, and I certainly will again, because, again, retrospectively looking back, I learned about so many bands and, you know, other cultural things like John Waters, for instance, through that magazine. And what it was done on sort of very low-grade newspaper, kind of newsprint kind of paper that it was printed on. And it was done, I think it was printed out of New Jersey, but it was all New York writers at the time, Lisa and Richard Robinson and Lillian Roxon from Australia before her untimely death. And in many ways, the template wasn't sort of like the new rock journalism of the 70s, but really more the film magazines of the 30s. It was very photo heavy. It wasn't really in depth. It was really kind of more like what would become a fanzine in the punk era a few years later. And I think I first learned about this magazine in 1974 because that was the year my elder siblings opened a unisex haircutting salon, Roxy, in downtown London. It was right across from the News Depot. It was upstairs and right across. Bluebird Records was downstairs. And the News Depot, which is still there, one of the very few things left from that time on Dundas Street, had all sorts of international magazines and also more of the underground magazines in music. So that's where I started buying the British press sometimes because it was expensive and I didn't have a lot of money, Melody Maker and NME. But also there was this Rock Scene magazine that was pretty cheap. And my older siblings had started buying it and we started reading it. And the big thing was, at the time, as I had talked about in the Roxy Music podcast, my big focus in music and rock music were the glam acts, David Bowie, Roxy Music, New York Dolls, Mott the Hoople, etc. And over here in North America, those bands didn't get the same level of coverage or prominence that they did over in England when I was reading the English magazines. And the thing about Rock Scene was the content in it seemed split between three camps. First, there was a lot of the big mainstream rock acts of the day, like the Stones and Led Zeppelin, etc., who I loved. But really the glam acts were more the stars of the issue. I think they put in some of the other bands, not because they didn't like them, but the focus really was more on the glam underground in England and New York City. And that is what pulled me into the magazine because the sort of groups I liked and the sort of artists I like were like Suzi Quatro, who was American, but really was big in Britain, and you didn't really read about her here, but she was one of my favorite artists of that time. So the fact that they put coverage of these acts front and center really drew me into the magazine. And then there was about, my enduring favorites from the previous generation. But there was all these other bands. They all seemed to be from New York, playing in these clubs. The two that seemed to be prominent was one that was called CBGB's and another one was Max's Kansas City. And most of these groups, actually none of these groups, had made a record at this point. So I would be picking up this magazine to read about Roxy Music and David Bowie. And then I'd be reading about who is Patti Smith? Who is Television? Richard Hell? And they would be getting the same level of coverage. They'd be playing at these clubs. But it's like, who are these people? And not only who are these people, but this is just a completely different world. This doesn't look like anything that's happening. This doesn't even look like glam rock. What is this? Intuitively, I was just drawn to this. This was fascinating and made sense, even though it was baffling. Even when I could, notice some of the elements. For instance, I've written about seeing Blondie, and it's on the blog. And I delve into a lot of this in the blog entry and talking about discovering Blondie not as a musical entity, but first finding out about them in the summer of 1975 through Rock Scene. I could see, okay, we've got the early period Beatles and girl groups, and there was a lot of sort of 50s and 60s nostalgia happening at that time, Happy Days, American Graffiti, and all that. But this was different. And also, I could only imagine what these groups sounded like because most of them hadn't even made records yet, let alone been on the radio. I also noticed that the New York Dolls, who had fallen apart in the middle of the decade, were part of this scene as well. David Johansen seemed to be there. And then it looked like Johnny Thunders had this new group called the Heartbreakers with Jerry Nolan. So I was seeing connections, and it was fascinating because every issue, one of these bands would be there. Now, I started reading the magazine in 74, and I think it went from 73 to 83. One thing I do have to say here is there's a gentleman named Ryan Richardson who has actually established a website, www.rockscenester.com, where he's put up PDF versions of every issue of the magazine. And if you're listening out there, Mr. Richardson, thank you so much. I've had so much pleasure spending hours going through the magazines up there. Many of these I've owned, and it's almost like reuniting with old friends. Oh, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention another artist I found out about through Rock Scene, Wayne County, who later transitioned into Jane County, but released many recordings under that name, and wrote a column for Rock Scene magazine, which was my favorite, Dear Wayne. It was an advice column, and one of the letters I remembered when I went back through the Rock Scenester site, I found it, and it was a woman named Debbie Pickup from Bridgeport, Connecticut, writing that she was distressed that she was always hassled about her name, Debbie Pickup. People say, "Oh, Pickup, is that your name or your reputation?" And she's asking, "Well, what would you do?" And Wayne's response was, "I think your name is simply Fantasia." So anyway, she says, "I would kill to have the name Debbie Pickup." So anyway, so that was always a highly entertaining column and lots of great advice. So Rock Scene was started in 1973. And Roxy opened in 74. So that's about when I started reading it. And I started reading about this other band, these four guys that wore ripped jeans and leather jackets and had fairly short hair, most of them, which was very unusual for the 70s at that time. It completely went counter to, what you were supposed to be doing in terms of being cool. And they all seemed to have the same last name. So were they brothers and it was this band called the Ramones. That's how I thought it was first pronounced. Because, of course, no one was saying this out loud. None of my even friends knew of any of this stuff. I was following the Ramones for the first few years, and then they had out, I think it was around the time that first album came out. I think my sister said something about it, and it was like the Ramones. I went, oh, the Ramones, yeah, okay, right. Now, I was very aware of that album coming out in the summer, the spring, and then through the summer of 76. But I didn't get a chance to hear it at that time. My tastes were still sort of more into the old wave and even the glam or whatever. But because I didn't have tons of money to buy a lot of records, and will I like this? Will I know what it's like? So I didn't buy it initially, but I really wanted to hear it. I thought, what does this sound like? And bit by bit, I had been hearing other groups from the New York scene. I remember first seeing Patti Smith on the Mike Douglas show, and then Blondie on there as well. Then the other really strange thing was in the British press, all of a sudden, I'm reading about these bands from Britain. There's this band, the Sex Pistols and the Clash, and then there's this festival in this club, and it's like, oh wow. So, and then the Ramones have been playing over there, and okay, so it's kind of jumped the Atlantic. This is happening there now. So this is really interesting. There's two scenes. So the Ramones released their debut in 76. Leave Home in early 77, and it's like, yeah, I just really want to hear this. And I didn't get to hear them until I went to the UK in the summer of 77 with my parents. Now, punk was just exploding everywhere through the country at that time, and it was just fantastic to be there. Also, too, is like my parents would go shopping or whatever, and I'd always go to the record department or to a record store. And of course, who's working in record stores? People who want to be playing all the hit music. So I heard so many of the new records and new bands just hanging out in record stores in Britain in 77. And that's where I heard them. And it was the first album. And it was like, it was hard. It was a bit like when I heard New Rose by The Damned. It was so fast to my ears at the time, it was hard to even process, which is kind of funny now because, of course, both of those songs have a lot of velocity. Blitzkrieg Bach, which opens the album, and New Rose by The Damned. But what I notice now really is the hookiness of it and a lot of the melodicism and the clever lyrics and that sort of thing. So that's where I first heard them, and I started getting the albums and sort of going into the back catalog and getting them all really in 78. So even though I'd been following them from the start, it was kind of 78 where I really heavily got into listening to them. Also, although I'm not much of a musician, the instrument I do play is bass. And I was learning or trying to learn to play in around that time. And if you're doing that and you want something simple, there's nothing better in the world than the first Ramones album, because the guitar is on one channel, the bass on the other. For most of it, you just turn off the guitar channel and you can play along exactly. And pretty much anyone can. And that was, of course, the point and the beauty, but it was also damn clever, as with many things about the Ramones. Indeed, that clever self-awareness about the Ramones often gets overlooked and was part of their being potent. They were engineering what they were doing, and they knew what they wanted to do in terms of sound and how to present themselves. And as for that sound, you really can't say enough, because it's one of those albums. The first Ramones album really is a line in the sand. There's lots of predecessors to that sound, of course, with the 60s, the surf sound, the British Invasion. And then you had tracks like David Bowie's Hang On to Yourself, something like T-Rex's Solid Gold, Easy Action. A lot of these tunes, and of course the Stooges, MC5, New York Dolls, you had all these elements preceding punk. And of course, punk rock for me, especially back then, it wasn't so much of a templated sound. It was more of an idea, and that's still how I see it. So my idea is maybe a little bit larger, but if you're going to say to me what's sort of a trademark punk rock sound, the Ramones nailed it. It's really one of the few albums that is completely original. There's elements of it, once again, going back to the Stooges and the Velvets and garage rock, of course, but there really isn't another album that sounds like that. The closest I could think of is a couple of those Stooges demos that got released a whole lot later, from like 71. But they were just demos then that very few people heard. That first Ramones album is a landmark. No one ever made an album sound like that before. And of course, there's been a zillion albums that emulate that sound since. So it is, as with the band, a true original. Now, while the album didn't sell many copies right off the bat, it was the shot heard around the world and kickstarted the UK scene and countless bands everywhere. There was always a story that the Ramones would go out on their first tour, they'd be playing at clubs, and just a handful of people would show up. When they went back the next time, the place was packed and several bands had been formed from the members who were there. With this new shift in focus happening in different cities, and it had been happening in Toronto too, independently of what was going on in these other cities. Liz Worth put together a fantastic oral history of the Toronto and regional punk scene, which actually dips down into London, called Treat Me Like Dirt a few years ago. And her book really looks at that, how even though these scenes were happening in these other cities, it was happening in Toronto too, totally independently. People going back and getting into the Stooges and the Velvets and all that sort of thing. And I guess, as Malcolm McLaren once said, if somebody's got a great idea, several people are usually thinking it at the same time, so it's a race who does it first. With the Toronto scene off and running in the mid-70s, punk really didn't take off in London until late 77. Now, one of the key gigs that happened in London at this time that really helped kickstart the scene was the arrival of Eddie and the Hot Rods from the UK in the fall of 77. And sadly, the late, great Barry Masters, who was their singer, recently passed away. Now, they had come out of the pub rock scene, which came just before punk. My brother had a Dr. Feelgood album, and he'd come back from England in the summer of 76 with this EP, Eddie and the Hot Rods Live at the Marquee. That was a really exciting record to hear in 1976. Now, punk came hard on pub rock's heels and sort of obliterated it in a way. Although I had just come back from the UK at the time and had brought their new single back with me, Do Anything You Want to Do, which is still, I think, one of the best singles of the 70s. Now, they played at Fryfogel's, but I was like 14, 15 and looked about 13, 12. So there's no way I could get in. But my elder siblings went, along with plenty of others. And now I could be wrong in this chronology, but I believe the Demics played their first gig at a loft downtown just a few months after that. It was around Christmas or New Year's, and I'm pretty sure my siblings were there, and that kind of kicked things off in London, Ontario. So as with places outside of the main centers, like London is equidistant between Toronto and Detroit, 2 hours each way. And the population around that time would have been about 200,000. And particularly back then, London was especially old school and conservative. But London also had this radical arts background from the 60s with the Nyla Spasm Band and a lot of artists that came out of the city and produced a unique body of art that wasn't just a replication of what was happening in Toronto. But it seemed a lot of that fiery spirit had died in the creative realm in London, and the Demics coming around and kickstarting the scene, and then the Regulators and NFG and the Sinners and the Zealots really made London a much more interesting place, and made for a lot of great nights out with a lot of fun music, and brought a lot of people together. As I'll talk about, it was sort of the outcasts of the city, especially in a city like London, where you kind of met, oh, you're the sort of weirdo from that neighborhood or whatever. And I mean that in an endearing and positive way. So throughout 78, the Demics ruled the roost here in London. And by early 79, the Demics had released their debut EP, Talks Cheap, a fantastic 5-slice piece of punk, highlighted by the slower, more mid-tempo New York City, which has gone on to attain some renown, and deservedly so. It's a great song. Now, I know that it's Keith Whitaker of the Demics having a poke at someone that I won't say, because the someone he's having a poke at I rather liked, and frankly introduced me to the Velvet Underground, so I'm sort of in their debt forever. And sadly, both have passed away. But New York City is a great song. The whole EP is terrific. And again, it was the first real record from the London scene, and it was a good one. Now, again, because I just couldn't get into clubs at this time, I never got to see the Demics sort of in their regency here in London, Ontario. By the time that EP came out in 79, they were already in Toronto, which of course makes sense. You have to expand your audience, and that's where things were happening in Canada. So, by the time of this concert, the Ramones had put out 4 albums. Their debut, Leave Home, Rocket to Russia is my absolute favorite, Road to Ruin, which is my favorite sounding, and had just released their 5th album, produced with Phil Spector, which was their sort of, I guess it was their attempt to come into the mainstream, although his name really wasn't. It was a commercial name based on years past. He wasn't a hot producer at the time. Still, for the Ramones, who had taken so much inspiration from rock's early years and the brill-building sound associated with Spector, especially from Joey's perspective, it was an interesting idea to meld the two of them together. Now, in terms of the Demics, they had been building up their reputation in Toronto and Ontario and recorded their debut album. Now, they'd lost original guitarist Rob Brent, replaced by Steve Koch, and they released their self-titled debut, it was the spring of 1980, right around the same time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for this podcast, I also interviewed my old friend who's been in the UK for many decades now, living up in Leeds, who we will call Special Guests. So here's where Special Guests was at this point in his life in terms of being a fan, what he was listening to, going to the show. We'll cut over to you, Special Guests. Could you first talk about how did you come to learn about the Ramones? So when did you hear about them? How did you learn about them? That sort of thing.
Okay, I can't remember the exact year. It was probably about maybe 1979, Yeah, it would have been 79, I think. It was through my sister. My sister was getting into a lot of different music at the time. And I think I was starting to sort of discover things. I was starting to listen to things like Blondie and Elvis Costello, The Cars. And then I kind of discovered the Ramones from just listening to music that wasn't getting played on the radio.
Okay. So when you heard them, did you like them right away, or was it something that took on you? What was it about the band that appealed to you?
It was an instant like. It was the look, the music, the words. I remember especially liking Beat on the Brat quite just because I thought it was a hilarious song and absolutely loved it. And but I also found some of the stuff quite melodic as well,
Hmm.
and quite very poppy. So it
Well,
wasn't like really kind of overly garish, and I think. But I found stuff like Sheena is a punk rocker and things like that, where I think are really quite poppy songs.
as it turned out, this was my only time seeing the Demics, so I was quite happy to see them. However, there was this sense in the city of, oh, it's them. We've seen them. They're too big. Who cares? And that was the beginning of my learning about these sorts of attitudes. My thing is, I like what I like. And quite frankly, if I like something, I want to share it with everyone. It didn't occur to me that people would sort of support someone, and then once they attained some level of success was like, oh, well, they're not our little pet project anymore. And I've always greatly poo-pooed that way of thinking. And quite frankly, I thought the Demics were terrific. They got a great crowd reaction. I loved seeing the set. I thought the energy was high. They sounded tight. They did their hometown proud. And they also did their predecessors proud because, you know, really what the Ramones started in New York, the Demics had started in London, and it was this sort of coming together, and the boys did a great show. The gig took place at Centennial Hall. Now, as the name suggests, it's one of many projects that happened across the country here in 1967 to mark Canada's centennial year. It's about a 2,000-seater hall, and there's going to be upcoming gigs through the years I'll be talking about that took place there, including shows from The Smiths, Katie Lang, Radiohead, OMD, and Steve Earle. Now, Centennial Hall was part of a complex that was built along with a public square and our own funky City Hall building, one of the buildings in London that I still really like. It's got a V-pivot structure. Now, I had been to Centennial Hall once in the mid-'70s as part of a class choir performance, but this is the first time I had been back, and obviously for a very different kind of music event. Now, I can't remember when I first heard about the show happening, which is incredible because I'm sure I would have been beyond excited. I just can't recall the kernel of finding out for the first time. Now, it was pretty surprising that they were coming because generally we didn't get a lot of the bands sort of from the punk scene who were out touring because London at that time, once again, about 200,000 people. There were a few small clubs like the Cedar Lounge, which really didn't hold a lot of people. So acts beyond a certain size, it was difficult to play there because there just wasn't enough room. Or you had halls like Centennial Hall, like 2,000-seater halls, Alumni Hall. And now there was Wonderland Gardens, which I don't remember being used a lot at that time, but generally there wasn't sort of like a 500 to 800, 900 size venue to kind of get these acts in that they would have in Toronto. So a lot of the acts from the punk scene, both from New York, US and the UK, who would come over, they'd play Toronto, and of course we would all travel up 2 hours away. So that the Ramones were coming here to London was a big deal for people like me who were younger who couldn't just always get up to Toronto easily at that time and hadn't been able to see them. Now, unfortunately, I don't have my ticket for this concert. On my blog, I have most of the tickets for most of the shows that I've seen. However, there's a bunch where I've lost them, and this is one that unfortunately went walkies somewhere along the way. Although on the site there's a handbill that I've grabbed somewhere from the net. I don't know the source, but those handbills, I remember them being plastered all over downtown London on all the light poles. Now, as I mentioned, they were touring their fifth album, End of the Century, which was this Phil Spector production. And of course, it was going to be the merging of the wall of sound with the wall of volume. And it was going to be this very powerful sound, but quite frankly, for me, a lot of it resulted in a wall of headache. The album have its moments. The songs are good, but generally, I just find the sound overwrought, drained, forced. It's just dense. It just kind of sits there. The whole energy of the band is depleted. Now, there are a few tracks on the album I do like. The opening track, Do You Remember Rock and Roll Radio? I love Danny Says. The version of Chinese Rock, it's not bad. The Heartbreakers is better. Also, I Can't Make It on Time. And the version of Rock and Roll High School is not bad, but again, I prefer the original. But in general, it's really sluggish and you can feel it. It just doesn't work. Now, this was supposed to be their big bid for a larger commercial success. And in the UK, where their albums had made the charts and they'd had some minor hits, they had a bona fide top 10 with their cover of the Ronettes' Baby I Love You, featuring Strings, which was Heresy in Ramones land. And I think, what was it, Phil Spector may have had to use a gun or something to make those strings happen. Here in Canada, it hit 41 on the charts. Not bad, but people were expecting more like to go into the top 20. So while it did well and better than they had before, it wasn't the result people were expecting. However, at this point, the album had just come out. Expectations were high, so there was a very heightened sense of positivity around the band at this time. Now, I went to the gig with my sister and brother-in-law, and I knew 3 school friends who were going together, and they sat more in the middle. Now, as I said, I'm using pseudonyms for all the different people I'm talking about, and they'll be coming up in the series, and they're all over my blogs. As the people who are there, I will name as Lady B, Dandelion, and Count Mara. And they were sort of back. I saw them a little bit later, but as I said, I went in with my sister and brother-in-law, and we sat up in the balcony, right at the corner of the balcony at the left side of the stage. Again, these are early days of going to concerts, and I'm going with my older siblings or whatever who'd gone to lots of gigs. And there's a lot of people who like to kind of sit back and be a little bit back from the crowd. I'm not one of those people. I like to be right down front, as close as possible. I'm going to be talking about a Joe Jackson gig in London where my elbows were on the stage. Actually, that also happened with an Emmylou Harris show. I've seen Lucinda Williams play where basically I'm standing at her feet. Same with the specials, the Reform specials, when I saw them in Ottawa a few years back. So I'm a right down in front kind of a guy. But they wanted to go up there, so I watched the Demics from up there in the beginning of the set. Now, in terms of special guests, I'll turn it over to him, and he can talk about how he heard about the gig, how he came to be there, and where he was, and take it away special. You said that you went to the show with some friends from school.
Yeah.
How did you and the friends know about the Ramones? Did you introduce them to the band? Did they know about the band? Because I know myself, sort of around the time of this concert, I was just starting to meet people my own age into the band. But at that point over here, it was more older people who were into the Ramones than in the UK.
I can't remember exactly. I don't know whether I'd introduced them. I can't really remember that. Who was first and who was introduced to them. But I remember we all loved them. I can remember seeing the advert for the concert in the paper when I went home from school, and I was reading the paper and I saw the advert, and I nearly wet myself with excitement. I immediately phoned up my friend and went, "The Ramones are coming to town, the Ramones." And it was like, we have to get tickets. But I can't remember how long it was before the tickets went on sale before the gig. I can't remember. I don't think back then they wasn't too far in advance, because they advertise like a year in advance a lot of times now.
Yeah.
I don't remember it being that long.
No.
And I could be wrong, but I don't remember it being it wasn't like a year. I think it might have been a couple of months.
With that one, I can't really remember when I first heard about the gig or getting the tickets. All I just remember, I can't remember the specificity of it. When I learned, I was just thrilled, because at that point, very few bands from outside the region were coming to London in punk or new wave or alternative rock or whatever. So I know I was pretty damn excited, and I hadn't had a chance to see them in Toronto, because they'd come through Toronto on every tour. I think Toronto was one of the first kind of places out of their region that they played.
Yeah,
So,
I remember being really, really excited.
so what are your memories about the day and about the gig?
The day I was trying to, I remember as well, they did a record signing session. I think it was at Records on Wheels on Dundas Street.
Right. I didn't go to it, but I know some who did. You're correct.
I remember going, I think we got there really early, and the shop was shut. They shut it to get ready for them to be there. And I took my It's Alive album.
Oh, yeah.
Um, it was an import. My parents had bought it for me because they'd come over to England on a holiday, and they bought me the album. Because it wasn't released in Canada, I don't think, at the time.
No, it wasn't released in North America. It was just a UK release.
Yeah, so I took that with me thinking it would impress them, but it didn't. I can remember it sort of didn't say a word to them because I was so nervous. I remember handing my record over and shaking, but they didn't say a word to me, and I don't think they said a word to anybody else. I can't remember them talking at all.
Actually, I can remember one. I know someone who was there. This is the one story I remember. It was one of a few people. I can't remember which it was, but somebody said they handed their record and Dee Dee signed it, and he drew this little thing on it, like a little character, and said, "There, it looks like you," and they handed it back. That I remember.
That would be cool. I think I would have freaked out with that to mine. But I also remember regretting taking that particular album because it was a dark cover, so you couldn't really see the signatures very well.
Ah, right.
So I was a bit disappointed. I thought, I should have taken End of the Century or the debut.
Yeah. Nice clear cover. The ink would have come through.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you take the album along to the concert?
No. I must have gone home. So I think the signing must have been on the same day as the concert.
Oh, it was. Because you got to remember, too, at that time, they were kind of hitting one city a day. They didn't really have a lot of probably the cash to do otherwise. But I do remember the signing was in the afternoon. I don't know why I wasn't there, but I wasn't. And then the gig was in the evening. It was a very nice, I remember, too, it was a beautiful, warm, sunny May evening as well.
Yeah, So I must have gone home first. But I remember getting to Centennial Hall quite early, and I think I was chatting to some girl who, for some reason, had a Bob Marley concert ticket as well. So
for London that fall.
Yeah, was it, or maybe that was another concert? I can't remember. But anyway, I remember getting to Centennial Hall really early because I wanted to get to the front, which I managed to do. I was quite pleased with that.
Now, had you seen the Demics before?
I hadn't, no, because I was underage. I didn't go to any bars. I hadn't
seen the Demics. I was still underage at the time. I did start getting into the York and the Cedar Lounge because I was going in with older people, but it wasn't happening a ton because I always tended to look younger than my years, which I'm really happy about these days. But back then, that was not so much fun.
No, I hadn't seen that. I had the EP.
Yeah.
So I was really excited as well because I thought, I thought it was a good double bill. I thought, well, it's good. I know who the opening band is, and I really liked it. So I was, really excited to see them. Not as excited as the Ramones, but I'm still thinking, oh, good, I'll get a chance to see the Demics as well. I have a funny feeling, didn't they do a sound check really late? And I remember thinking, going in, and they were on stage doing a sound check.
Thank you, special guests, and for living up to your name. So once the Demics were done, we waited, and eventually the Ramones arrived. I remember them coming out on stage, everyone sort of freaking out down in the mosh pit. Well, they didn't call it a mosh pit at that time. With Dee Dee on the right hand of the stage, Joey in the middle, and Johnny on the left. And they pretty much stayed anchor there for the evening. I can't remember the set order. I should have gone on and looked to see if I can find a set list, but it was a case of Dee Dee sort of counting out 1, 2, 3, 4, and they just kind of went in. and they'd blast through one song, 1, 2, 3, 4 into the next, and literally they do about 5 or 6 in a row without stopping. It was exhausting to watch. It was a blast of levitating adrenaline, a noisy, joyous exhilaration, and exactly what I was hoping for. The speed of the set, as well as the volume, was pretty intense. But one of the key things I remember is at the end of the set, Joey coming out with the Gabba Gabba Hey sign when they were doing Pinhead, and a Pinhead came out on the stage. And once again, I'll turn over to special guests because he has some memories in that regard. I went to the gig with my sister and brother-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm trying to think, we definitely were there. We saw both sets. And they wanted to sit up in the balcony, sort of close to the stage. And we were up there for the Demics and the first chunk of the Ramones set. And then I said, oh, to hell with this. I'm going down. I don't want to sit up here and watch. And so the second half of the Ramones gig, I was right down on stage, sort of stage left in front of Johnny.
That's where I was.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, because of course, at that time, we had not met each other. We met each other in early 83. No. So that's, but again, I think back in the day, we talked about this. We were at we were at a number of gigs prior to our knowing each other before we knew each other. Like OMD's coming up. You were at the Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark gig, weren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a few more we were at, but so wow, we were in the same proximity. It was a lot of fun.
It was definitely. Show. I remember because I remembered being right in front of him, in front of Johnny. Is it Johnny? Yeah, Johnny the guitarist. I remember looking up at one time, and he was playing mid-song, and this big thing of drool sort of came from his mouth and onto the floor. But obviously, he didn't wipe his mouth. He was midway song. He didn't.
Yeah. There's not even a lot of... Well, that's kind of what blew me away is how they do like about 6 or 7 tunes in a row without stopping. So it was exhausting watching.
And it took me a little while to sort of figure out which songs sometimes, because they tended to sound when I was there, and it was so loud, and I was thinking it would take me a minute to actually hear what song it was. I was really trying to listen to listen to him sing, listen to Joey sing, because it's the only way I could at times figure out what song it was.
Yeah, because that's what I remember too, was the volume. Absolutely one of the loudest shows I ever saw. Probably about the loudest show I saw in a hall up until, believe it or not, the Buzzcocks in 1993.
Yeah.
That's it. Well, I'll be getting to that show much later, but that's one about 3 days later. My ears were still ringing.
Yeah, I remember at school the day after, and it was like my ears were still ringing. But they brought back memory of the night before, and thought it was so good.
So, any other memories about the show, or?
I was trying to remember. I can remember as well Joey bringing out the Gabba Gabba Hey sign.
Yes. That's right at the very end when they were doing Pinhead, and then the Pinhead came out and danced around. And he had the Gabba Gabba Hey sign. That's what I most remember.
And I remember getting really excited about that as well, because I think I'd already seen that film. Was Rock and Roll High School out at that time as well?
Yes.
Yeah, because I think I'd seen the film, and I remember seeing it in the film, and I thought, oh wow, I can't believe they brought this sign out.
Yeah, that was one of the standard things they always included in the set at that time. But again, still, it's like, there it is. It's the sign. It's seen in photos.
It's not quite the pyrotechnics that they have today.
No, but in its own way, it was exciting.
Oh, yeah, it was very exciting seeing a sign that said Gabba Gabba Hey on it.
Yeah. And also, the memory I have, he had the Gabba Gabba Hey sign, the song, well, they're doing Pinhead, that was the last song on the set. And then when it ended, it came to an abrupt stop. Joey just said, "How you doing?" and then walked off the stage. And then they came back for the encore. But it was a ton of fun.
Yeah.
But is there anything that you can think of to add about the gig, or?
No, I've been trying to think of what I could, because it was only like I remembered going to the record signing the other day, and it's like, oh wow, yeah, I couldn't remember. Those are the main things. I was like, I remembered the advert. I remembered going to get the album signed. I remembered queuing up. I remembered Johnny drooling. um, and it being really loud. But it's funny that we were probably stood next to each other,
Yeah.
or you were behind me or whatever. We're in that same one bit. That's
Yeah.
crazy.
Because
But
there's
not
only they
surprising.
had
It's surprising, but then not at the same time.
yeah. Because there really is only a certain amount of room between the front seats of Centennial Hall and the stage.
Yeah,
So it only went back a few feet, and the chairs, I believe, were there. For some shows they take the chairs up, but I believe the chairs were there for
chairs
that
were
one.
there. Yeah,
So
yeah,
we were feet apart.
yeah. Because I think we were sat down for the Demics. I'm not sure. I can't remember.
Okay, now, as I was talking about earlier in the episode, when looking back to this show, I see it as emblematic, or at least marking a moment in time where there was a real shift between one era and the next. And to talk about this, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to read from my blog, because I say a number of things here, and I don't think I can say it better live. So I'm going to read from the blog, and here we go. In retrospect, the pairing of these two bands at this gig was perfect, but in a bittersweet way. Both were the originators in their respective punk rock communities. The Ramones were from New York City. The Demics' best-known song was about New York City. Each had by this point replaced one of its founding members. Both were touring behind albums that were supposedly destined to take each to a new level of commercial viability, and both albums, while modest successes, fell well short of anticipated targets, signaling the end, figuratively or literally, of each group. And many of the people who were on that stage that night are now dead. So it was a celebration, all right, we just didn't know that it was a wake. Within a few months, the Demics had disbanded, never to reunite. As for the Ramones, I always felt as if a certain spark had left the building post-1980, as if they had been chastened. In the highly recommended 2005 documentary, End of the Century, The Story of the Ramones, Johnny confirmed what I'd always suspected, stating that, quote, "We did an album with Phil Spector. It was our big chance, and again, we didn't sell any records. So at that point, I finally accepted it. That's it. Just try to maintain our career, keep making money. It's just a job. Let's just do the best we can do, keep our fans happy, don't let them down, and don't worry about it. Accept it. This is our spot in life," unquote. Or, as Dee Dee says in the same doc, End of the Century started the breakup and the separation of the band. With the exception of one more PS of a great album in the form of 1984's Too Tough to Die, with Tommy Ramone returning once again to produce them, and a smattering of decent tunes strewn across 8 other discs, their days as an inspired, driven creative unit were over, although they continued on as a strong touring draw for another 16 years. On End of the Century's excellent opening track, Do You Remember Rock and Roll Radio?, Joey sang, "It's the end of the 70s, it's the end of the century." The Demics sang It's All Gone Wrong in their eponymous debut. While not the intent, these lyrics could work as elegies for these bands of a certain era that was now about to pass. The Ramones now seem more ubiquitous than ever, with Blitzkrieg Bop popping up in commercials and at sporting events. I Want to Be Sedated has somehow become a staple of oldies and classic rock stations, at least up here, because I can tell you back in the day, you never heard the Ramones on mainstream radio.
Yeah. I'm probably for the T-shirts.
Yeah, probably for the T-shirt. And their Arturo Vega designed band logo beams out from T-shirts throughout the world, which is, of course, what Special Guest was just talking about. The Demics even got some posthumous huzzas when Canadian alt-radio affiliated magazine Chart voted New York City as the best Canadian single of all time in a 1996 poll. In an even more prestigious publication, the Top 100 Canadian Singles, Bob Merzero's 2010 book surveying a large cross-section of Canadian musicians and industry folk, New York City came in at number 62. Still, it would have been nice for these bands to have enjoyed the exposure and accolades within their lifetimes. At least all but Joey were still alive when the Ramones were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2002. Sadly, Joey's the one who would have wanted to be there most of all. As he name-checks predecessors who were key to him in rock and roll radio, Joey ponders, will you remember Jerry Lee, John Lennon, T-Rex, and Old Molty? Lennon had observed exactly 10 years earlier regarding the dissolution of the community that had engulfed his own life for the previous decade that the dream is over. With Lennon's assassination just a few months later, a naivete within rock music, a quality that in many ways had its good sweet points, vanished forever. For better or worse, this particular dream, birthed in the mid-'70s, had now run its course, with its multi-tangents of children taking over the playground. And now I'll just quote a lyric from Here Today, Gone Tomorrow, from the Ramones' Rocket to Russia record. It's over, it's true, it's true. And I think of times we were together. As time went on, it seemed forever. But times have changed. That wraps up my look at this era-defining show here in London. Now, if you were at the gig, be sure to go to my blog, mylifeinconcert.com, and in the comments at the end, you can leave your memories, what you recall about the gig. You can also leave your memories on our Facebook page. Remember to like and follow. Now, My Life in Concert is a no-asshole zone. Crappadoodle's behavior will be blocked. Enough said. Curmudgeons and contrarians, piss off, so play nice or be gone. Anyway, I'd like to thank special guests for dropping by and sharing in his memories, and he'll be popping by again with other shows coming up in the series, adding his memories in. Thanks for taking the time, and much appreciated with your remembrances.
It's my pleasure. Anytime you want to talk about any more, just get in touch, and I will be.
Trust me, more will be coming. It was a few years before you moved, and we were at a lot of the same gigs. So
yeah, true. Right. Yeah.
Live at Leeds, indeed, and special guests will certainly be joining me for more episodes in the future. And next time I have you on, let's discuss both our pseudonyms, various artists, and special guests, because it's connected to you and an in-joke we had. Do you remember that? We'll talk about it next time. To reiterate, to kick off the series, I'm starting off by looking at one show from each of the 5 decades where I've been a concert goer. And episode 1 of the podcast was Roxy Music in London in 1975. Coming up next, I'll be scooting ahead 12 years to the midst of the grunge era and Lollapalooza 1992. The Red Hot Chili Peppers, Ministry, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and Lush, Molson Park, Barrie, Wednesday, August 5th, 1992. Talking about the music, but that was also... It was a time of a lot of change and a lot of change in music I didn't think was going to happen, but also a lot of change in my life. And it was a time when the world was opening up. So I'll be going back to that time and thinking about those bands, those experiences, etc., etc. After that, I'll be skipping ahead to the 2000s with the last time I saw David Bowie with the Polyphonic Spree opening at the Corel Center, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, Friday, April 2nd, 2004. An absolutely stunning final gig from David Bowie. And then skipping ahead one more decade, and Leonard Cohen, the one and only time I finally got to see him, and oh my goodness, it did not disappoint. I'm Your Man at the Scotiabank Place, Ottawa. Yeah, it's the same as the Corel Center. December 7th, 2012. So, of course, this podcast series started life as a blog, and those blog entries are still there, mylifeinconcert.com. I also post the podcast there, as well as on YouTube, our VATV, My Life in Concert video channel. And you can follow us on Facebook. Instagram's coming soon, I promise. It may even be in place by the time we're on the air. And you can listen to the podcast on Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts, and our podcast home, Buzzsprout. Hey everyone, this is your host, Various Artists, and I want to thank you all for listening. See you next time for Lollapalooza 92, where I'll be reading from notes that I took throughout the day at the show, here on mylifeinconcert.com.